Well, let's take a look at the gameplay. We're going to show you all the different resources, all of the different options available to you as you sit down to play the game, and talk a little bit about the dynamics of the game. And that's a key word, because even though we're going to talk about all the phases, not every phase happens every turn. There are some phases that are dynamic, and at the roll of a die could not happen at all, or at the roll of a die could be left up to the active player to choose if they're going to happen or if they're not. So, let's grab our brass goggles, let's grab our copper bolts, and let's jump into the world of Gearworld. So Gearworld, the Borderlands, has a beautifully large map. The original game Borderlands did not have these additional islands that are on the outside, but it does add a nice little interesting piece to this in terms of bridging things, literally, from the islands to the main lands. One of the goals of this game is you're going to be doing a lot of building with the resources you're going to collect. And what's going to happen is you're going to take a bridge, and you're going to have a bridge going between these two abutments. So it has to go exactly to where the diamond-shaped edges are going to meet. So in this case, Simon's Landing connects to Watts Coast. You could also connect these two abutments and go from Simon's Landing to Grey Water, or you could go from Simon's Landing down to Menlo Point. And each of the areas around of the islands and the mainland are going to have those options for you to build to gain access to those islands or get access from the islands onto the mainland. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, the main reason is because the way you win this game is by building skyworks. Skyworks are these square tokens that allow you to be placed inside of an area and will give you bonuses for doing so. But the first player to place 3 of them on the board is going to win the game. Now, just like anything else, there's a cost to building things, including the skywork. And you're not just going to be able to build that at the beginning of the game. You're going to have to build up resources. Now, there's different resources. There are scrap, there are gold, there are horses, there are iron, and there are coal. And the game comes with these production tokens. You're going to use these production tokens at the beginning of the game by flipping them face down, shuffling them up, and then placing them one by one, each player taking a turn, and putting them out in different areas. Then, after you acquire your areas, you're going to start to determine what's being produced in each of these areas. There's quite a bit of tokens, so the game board gets filled up pretty quickly. Now, on each of those areas, at the beginning of each turn, you're going to put one of those production resources. So if, for instance, I had gold here on Watts Coast, at the beginning of the turn, I'm going to have the opportunity to potentially put gold on here. Now, there is a limit sometimes as to how many pieces of a certain resource are going to be able to be on a location, and you're going to be moving them around, because just because I potentially use one of my red guys here and I own this Watts Coast location doesn't mean that I have all the resources I need to build something in it. So I may actually need to get this gold over to the prospect, and that's when you're going to start supply chaining. And we'll talk about that in a second. But it's good to know that there's basically those major resources in the game. Now, another thing to note is that these guys, these little characters, all they do is represent that the red player is in control of this territory or this region or this area, as it's called in the rulebook. It doesn't represent an army, it doesn't represent might or force or really anything other than I own that area. Your might and your force is going to come from numbers like the 3 on the watchtower, or the skyworks, 3 on the guns that you're going to be able to produce, and from riverboats and from ships, and also from alliances with your neighbors. Now, the game is broken down into turn orders. You're going to have the build phase, the production phase, the trade phase, the transport phase, and the battle phase. Let's talk about these individually. The build phase is fairly straightforward. Down here in the bottom of the map, you'll see that there is a building cost. And it'll show you that to build a bridge, you're going to need an iron and a scrap. To build a gun, you're going to need an iron and a coal, or 2 gold. That's what the line separating the top and the bottom means. To build a riverboat, you're going to need 3 scrap. To build a skywork, you will need 1 of each resource. You're going to need a iron, a coal, a scrap, and a gold, or 4 gold. And then to build a ship, you're going to need 4 scrap or 4 gold. So as you can imagine, gold gets a little valuable. Now, the build phase is skipped during the first turn, and you're just going to go straight to the production phase. In the production phase, each one of the regions that has a production token on it is going to produce that material. There are some more detailed rules about that, determining when and how many of each type is going to be in there. But for example, if this was the beginning of this turn for the production phase, we would put 1 scrap in the prospect and 1 gold in the dry shore. In a regular game, this whole board is filled up. Not every region is going to have a production token, but a good majority of them are. Maybe about a third or so of them are going to be filled up with those. Now, then you go from the production phase to the trade phase. And the trade phase is where you can decide where, if I, as the green player, for example, own the dry shore, and the white player owns the prospect, and they want to trade materials, let's say the white player also owned Greenhold and owned the scrap here. And let's say they wanted to go ahead and make a trade and say, hey, green player, I need that gold. I'm going to give you these 2 scrap for that gold. You can do that and shift out the materials from one side to the other. If both parties agree on it, then everything is shifted, and you can move from as far as one corner of the map to the other corner of the map. And the reason you're going to want to be doing that is because when you pay to build something, the resources need to be in the region or in the area that you're going to build it in. Just because I have characters down here and up here that maybe allow me access to the resources for the Skyworks, I still need to get all of that into the prospect if I want to build the Skyworks in the prospect. And that's where it comes into transport. After the trade phase, you deal with transporting. And transporting allows you to move materials among regions that are adjacent to each other that you control. So if I wanted to move this gold from here to here, I could do that by foot. But more importantly, the horse resource, which is one of the production tokens that you could get, allow you to chain things together and move even further. Horses also, as you'll notice, have a 1 on them, so they're going to add to your strength in battle. We'll talk about that in a second. But the supply chaining is a way for you to move things really quickly, very fastly. If you're moving on foot, you're only going to be able to move a short distance. So in this case, from one area to another. But if you have horses in different regions connecting things together, you could potentially move 5, 6, 10 regions, assuming that you've set up your supply chain correctly that way. Now, after the transport phase, you go to the battle phase. And the battle phase allows you to do an opportunity of 1 attack action during your first turn, and after the first turn, a possibility of 2 attack actions or an attack action and an additional transport action. Now, attacking is very simple. It's a matter of checking how much strength you have versus how much strength your opponent has. You get 1 strength for occupying a territory. So while technically these guys don't mean they're an army, it does mean that they give you 1 strength when you're dealing with battle. But then in addition, you're going to get strength for the guns that you've produced in the areas you have. So if I had a gun produced in this area, this would provide me 4 strength in this area. If I had additional boats, for example, like if I have a river boat on this river piece, and it's between Riverholt and Greenholt, this area has 4 total ability to be able to defend itself. There's also ships that will give you 5, and these guys are on the outside in the sea, and they point in. One of the aspects of the game is it has these diamond ends that are going to point in. But more importantly becomes movement points. And when you're talking about supply chaining and moving, you have little movement points here that are also on the map that shows you that horses can move 2, riverboats can move 8, and ships can move 10. So there's a vast amount of movement that can happen right there. But when we're talking about combat gets even more interesting, because combat has the ability to not only look at the defender and the attacker's strength. So let's say these guys are down here on the Skywatch Hill, and let's say they're adjacent to each other. And let's say the green player has a gun in there. Well, this is 4 strength and this is 4 strength. But what can happen during combat is you can ally with another player and be able to use their strength from adjacent areas. But more importantly, you can do what's called spearheading. And what spearheading allows you to do is if you flip these over, there is a gray side to those units as well. Any unit that is within movement range of the battle area is allowed to potentially be added to the strength as well. So when you're doing the combat phase, it's not always just a matter of where you are on the board and the combat situation is on the board, but it is also where your supporting units are around you on the board that could potentially add themselves to the attack if they were to be called to the battle as well. That can get a little confusing at times, but once you understand the movement and how quickly and how speedily boats, riverboats, ships, and horses can move, it becomes a lot easier to understand and a lot quicker to do. Our battles are very, very quick, and they're actually the shortest part of the turn. The negotiation and the transport usually turns into the longest turn. Now, while there is a possibility of player elimination in this by defeating someone, because if I were to defeat this green player to defeat this white player, then the green player puts one of their characters in and the white player comes out, there is a potential to eliminate somebody. It's very rare that that's going to happen. This is actually much more of a game of negotiation and resource management than actual combat. And again, because all of these tokens, you can see there is a whole bunch of these production tokens that are going to get put out onto the board randomly, one in each different area, not each area, but one in a different area during setup. There's going to be a lot of resources that get put on this board. And the victory really is going to come down to who is going to be able to manage the control of those resources moving around the board much more than just military might. Can you win with military might moving around and conquering areas? Yes, you can. But it is going to be a game of catch-up because your opponents are going to be able to use their transports and their supply chains to move resources away from your forces as they're moving around the board as well. So there's a delicate balance between the concept of the resources and the concept of combat. Now, one really important thing about these phases: the production phase, the trade phase, and the transport phase are all dynamic. What does dynamic mean? Well, dynamic means at the beginning of those phases, the active player with the first player token rolls a die. And if it rolls a 6, the phase does not happen. If it rolls a 5, the player with the first player token chooses if the phase happens. On a 1, 2, 3, and 4, the phase happens as normal. So, mechanics-wise, let's talk a little bit about the gameplay. I love the negotiation. I think the negotiation is phenomenal. At the end of the day, the way you win the game is by putting 3 skyworks on the board. But it's not about military control and fighting and taking over things. You can win that way. The real way you win this game is by supply chain management and resource management. And what happens in this game is you start to realize really quickly that A, having iron over here with one player and gold over here with another, and being able to magically swap them from one side of the island to the other just through negotiation is extremely powerful. Especially when you spent 6 turns trying to build a supply chain that just lets you move things 3 areas. That was a huge impact to our experience. We'll get to that in a second. But the negotiation piece of it is good because there's always a question of, okay, we're negotiating now and we're friends, but are we going to be enemies in a minute? Are you going to ally with him when he tries to attack me? What's going to happen 2 turns from now when I move a little bit closer and maybe you feel like I'm encroaching in your area? There's a lot of unknowns around that, a lot of player interaction that's really well done. I'm not even sure why this is an option inside of this game. We have house ruled it and completely taken it out and had a much better experience in it. We hope you enjoy all of your transportation activities inside of Gearworld: The Borderlands.